Welcome to the Institute of All Intelligent Life. My name is Alan Kiesler. We are continuing our class on extraterrestrial spirituality. And today we have several topics we're going to cover. I'm going to briefly review a little of the very old history of our solar system and our planet, according to different extraterrestrial sources, and how it relates then to the development of what we consider a history by Western scholarship, coming into the Sumerian and Mesopotamian and Babylonian cultures. And then I'm going to try to move a little further in the direction that I did in the last class, of correlating extraterrestrial sources of knowledge, both historical and spiritual ideas, with that of terrestrial ideas about our history and our religion and spirituality. So first I'm not going to go back into the further past and different sources, because there are various sources of information that are, of course, not accepted by Western academia, not accepted by many different groups of people who have a certain fixed idea about what human history may be from their own sources. But there are very ancient ruins or very ancient archaeological artifacts, and there are very stories of very ancient times, going back even millions of years, in very ancient human history. But we will not go back that far, but just to about 500,000 years, maybe 1 million to 500,000 years, because these dates are contested. But the date I'm going to start with, because we had talked about this previously, is the creation of the asteroid belt in our solar system, which evidently was the result of the destruction of a large planet that existed in the area of the asteroid belt. Now, I had not gone into detail about it, but I had mentioned Zecharia Sitchin's accounts of some of the stages of human history, going back about 200,000 years. But I'm just going to push that back for now to this other time period of 500,000 to 1 million years ago, when something happened, and there are different accounts, there are different timelines about how to explain this. But one thing that I'm quite convinced of, and there are a number of scientists who also have accepted this explanation as the most reasonable one, that there was a large planet, an Earth-like planet in the sense that it was not like Jupiter or Saturn, or Uranus and Neptune, which are called gas giants. They're gaseous planets, but a hard planet, an earthly planet with a hard crust, and evidently mountains, oceans, an atmosphere. And something happened. Zecharia Sitchin's explanation is based on his interpretation of ancient Sumerian texts, that the planet Nibiru and its satellites came near to that planet, which is often called Marduk, and that planet is called Maldek. I'm going to be talking about Marduk a little bit later, but Maldek is the usual name given to that planet. And it was destroyed by one of two different probable scenarios. One, Zecharia Sitchin's explanation that the planet Nibiru and its moons approached nearby it, and because of that sort of collision, or anyway, the result of the nearness of that planet, whether it was a direct collision of the planet or the collision of one of its moons, Maldek was destroyed. The other explanation, which comes from many sources, including especially Corey Goode and other secret space program sources, that actually there was a war between the residents of Maldek and the residents of another planet, or perhaps a moon, of Maldek. And the most commonly accepted of those theories is that Mars, the planet today that we know of as Mars, was at that time a moon of the planet Maldek. And there was a war between those two civilizations on those two planets, or perhaps some other forces were involved which were very powerful and had what we might call particle beam weapons, or what we might call, as in the Star Wars series, a weapon that was powerful enough to totally destroy an entire planet. So again, without going into any details at this time, I will just mention that that's one other explanation, that there was a great war and somebody had a planet that was powerful enough to destroy Maldek. In any case, Maldek was either exploded or destroyed in some way, and it became, at least a large part of it, became the asteroid belt. And dating it to about 500,000 to 1,000,000 years ago seems to me very reasonable. Now what's important for us is what happened subsequently. Again, I'm going to report on the two different theories. One of Zecharia Sitchin, whose basic explanation was that after Nibiru came near or crashed into Maldek, creating the asteroid belt, the residents of Nibiru started coming to the Earth. According to Zecharia Sitchin, the Earth was a part of Maldek. Maldek was destroyed, and a large part of it became the Earth, and the rest of it became the asteroid belt, and some parts of it became, or some parts of its satellites became the comets. So that's Zecharia Sitchin's explanation of that event, which I'm quite convinced did happen at that time, 500,000 years ago or more. And after that, this planet of Nibiru, which could be a planet of our solar system, or it could be a planet of the star, the invisible, that is the infrared star, which is a red dwarf star, which is a companion star of our sun. So Nibiru could be a planet circling that sun or that star, or it could be having an orbit that somehow circles both our sun and its companion star. In any case, Zecharia Sitchin's theory is that the residents of Nibiru, the Anunnaki, came to Earth, and I've described this briefly in my previous classes, and I'm just going to summarize it in one or two sentences now, that the Anunnaki, the residents of Nibiru, then came to Earth because they found gold here and they needed gold, and they were mining gold, and as a result of their hard work, the Anunnaki workers in the mines rebelled, and finally humanity was created by the Anunnaki as workers for them, so that their own workers could be relieved of all that hard work. Okay, now that later part of this story, 200,000 years ago, is the date that Zecharia Sitchin gave for the creation of humanity by the Anunnaki, using genetic engineering, in which they upgraded the advanced primate, what we call Homo erectus. They hybridized it, injecting some of their own DNA into it, and created Homo sapiens. Now, I'm just wanting to compare that with the story that we get from the secret space programs, like Corey Goode, for example, and others who have similar ideas from the same source. So, in this account, Mars, also like Zecharia Sitchin had stated, Mars could have been a moon of Maldek, the planet that got destroyed. And when Maldek exploded, or however it happened, Mars was fairly nearby, so the debris from Maldek's explosion created many craters on Mars, on half of Mars. That's the side of Mars facing Maldek. And this is what we observe today, that one hemisphere of Mars has many craters on it, and the other side of Mars has very few craters on it. And similarly, that side of Mars that has the craters on it has about a 20-kilometer excess crust, and the hemisphere on the opposite side about 20 kilometers less, and at the hemisphere border between those two halves of Mars, the crust gradually decreases, or fairly rapidly decreases, from that 20-kilometer depth to the zero depth of the other side. So that seems to be some fairly good evidence that Mars was in fact nearby Maldek, and when Maldek exploded, it created this crater situation and this excess crust situation on Mars. So according to, again, the secret space program sources, the atmosphere of Mars at that time was torn away, for the most part, by that explosion of Maldek. So the residents of Maldek who were able to escape, and the residents of Mars who had a much easier time at escaping from Mars, because simply their moon or their planet was not destroyed or exploded, but it simply lost its atmosphere and became uninhabitable. But they had more time to get away. So in any case, the atmosphere of Mars having been mostly lost, the residents of Mars had to leave, and they chose to come, maybe not immediately, but eventually to Earth. And perhaps they went to the moon first. But the moon, and there is quite a lot of evidence that about that time, whether it was 500 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago, perhaps longer, but at some point in time, we got the moon. That is, we did not have a moon before that. And there are many ancient myths, you might call them, or ancient memories, both in the Western Hemisphere, Native American sources, as well as other cultures in the Eastern Hemisphere, including even historians of the Mediterranean, like the Egyptian and Greek and even Roman sources. They recount ancient memories of a time when we had no moon. So according to this idea about Maldek's explosion, Maldek may have had several moons, large moons by our standards, one of which was our moon, and another one of which was Mars. So our moon was either hollowed out, it was not our moon at that time, formerly a moon of Maldek, which was hollowed out, or perhaps it was artificially constructed as a huge space vehicle even, or a place where people could live inside the moon. So in any case, the residents of Maldek who could escape and the residents of Mars who went to the moon, they came into the area of our Earth, and the moon became the moon circulating around the Earth sometime after 500,000 years ago, or somewhat more or less. But this is a very, very important development for the future of Earth, the future meaning from that time, 500,000 years ago, because many other races also started coming. I just will mention one other very important piece of information, and that is, as I mentioned earlier, millions of years ago, there were other races also, and one of them is usually given the name, or often given the name, of the ancient builder race, or the Guardians, which was an ancient, very advanced civilization, and evidently they were quite similar to humans, although according to some sources they looked more like felines, but they were humanoid, but somewhat of a feline appearance. In any case, that ancient builder race had protected our solar system and even other star systems, other systems of nearby stars, because this area of the galaxy was very important and valuable to them. So they had actually created a grid to protect our solar system and the nearby star systems. And about this time, whether it was 500,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago, according to some sources, somewhat more than that, but when Maldek was destroyed, at that time the grid that had been protecting our solar system and the nearby star systems was also destroyed. So after that, many different extraterrestrial races came to our solar system, and some of them were quite warlike, as were the Maldekians, the residents of Maldek, and the Martians, the residents of Mars at that time that had led to that war, according to that explanation of the destruction of Maldek. So there were a lot of wars in our past history, just as we have now. That is, after this period of time. Not in the ancient time of 1,000,000 or 2 or 3 or more million years ago. But to speak of even 1,000,000,000 years ago, there are some records of very, very ancient advanced civilizations here. But we're not going back that far. But in this period of 1,000,000 or 500,000 of years ago, a lot of wars took place. And when the extraterrestrials, that is, extra solar system races came, they were also, some of them were warlike, and there was a lot of fighting going on the moon also. The moon was a very, very valuable piece of real estate, you might say, because it had a lot of ancient technology. It may be, wherever it was situated at that time, that the ancient builder race had also had technology on the moon, or in the moon, we might say better, as well as somewhat on the surface, but mostly underneath the surface. So this was a very valuable place because of that technology, which was still to some extent functional, very ancient, many millions of years old technology built by the ancient builder race, or the guardians. So other races from other star systems had attacked the people from Mars or from Maldek who were living on the moon, and they eventually had to flee from there too. So this race is often given the name of the pre-Adamites. That is, this all happened before the creation of Adam, the creation of, we may say, Homo sapiens. So what happened was, after having taken refuge on the moon, then at one point, which could have been, I don't know the exact date, or maybe there was a series of wars and a series of attacks from which they had to flee, and they settled then as refugees on the Earth from the moon as a temporary residence. Before that, from Mars or Maldek. So when the refugees came to Earth from the moon, and they found that there were already people living here. There were two groups, actually there may have been many more, but there were at least two groups, one of which was a humanoid group, which was living underneath the surface, and which may have been living for a long, long time underneath the surface of the Earth. And so there were some conflicts, and then there was another race also, which was a reptilian race, which was also found on the planet. In fact, those reptilians, which have played an important role in human history, although they've concealed themselves quite thoroughly, they have sometimes claimed that they are the original inhabitants of Earth, and that's why they want to claim that it's their property and they have the right to control it. But in any case, there were some fights between the reptilians, between the subterranean Earth humans, and between the refugees who had come from the moon, who also evidently were humanoid. They were looking quite like humans, although according to Corey Good, they were specifically like 12 to 14 feet tall. And that may be because of having been resident on Mars, maybe having developed on Mars, they had less gravity, and so they would develop a greater height. And of course, living on the moon for maybe hundreds of thousands of years, they would also evolve into taller beings. In any case, when these pre-Adamites, as refugees from the moon, came to the earth, they had their own history, which then overlaps with the history that we have talked about from the sourced from the Sumerian texts, that as presented by Zecharia Sitchin especially. So what's interesting is that this 200,000 years ago period, that both modern Western anthropologists and biologists have dated to the beginning of Homo sapiens, about 200,000 years ago is the usual date. That is the date also given in the Sumerian texts for their story of the creation of humanity. That also fits in with this other story, because it could have been about that time that these refugees from the moon came, and they also had to hybridize themselves because they were not natives of the earth and they could not live here suitably, or it was difficult for them to, so they created hybrids also, just like the Niburians or the Anunnaki created a hybrid race, in that case to be workers for them. The refugees, the pre-Adamites as they're called from the moon, they had created a hybridized race. And they had two centers. One was in Central and South America, and the other one was in Asia and Europe, centered around the Mediterranean, Egypt, and perhaps going as far east as South Asia. So then we come to this, and this date could have been also a couple of 100,000 years ago. So the hybridization and the creation of Homo sapiens, according to these two different accounts, was done by the same sort of process, that is hybridization or genetic engineering, although for two slightly different reasons, either to create workers, as the Sumerian accounts would say have it, or to create a hybridized race that could serve as the rulers and as the successors, you might say, of the pre-Adamites who were not able to survive so well on the earth, especially once they had to face the reptilians who were already living here, who were inimical to them. So they created this hybridized race, which, as I understand it, again is humanity. Although it may have been previously a slightly different type of humanity, and whose more direct descendants are what we call today the Cabal, or who call themselves the Illuminati. They claim that they are royal bloodlines coming from the pre-Adamites. So they claim royal blood. Again, there's the other version that they claim that they are the descendants of the Anunnaki. In either case, we have a similar dating of a similar sort of event. So, to me, that is a good source for us to study further, because when there are two quite different accounts coming from two quite different sources, but having an awful lot of overlap, my conclusion is that there is probably a lot of truth in it. But we have to understand that each one of these sources, and there could be, of course, more than two, there are more than two sources, because there also is information coming from that subterranean race. So all these sources do seem to agree that there were these different races, different extraterrestrial races that had come here, and they fought among themselves, and they reached some sort of truce. Often they reached a truce between themselves. They agreed to stop fighting after some time when the fighting became unprofitable to everybody. So the next important date, which I also have already described, was about 13,000, 12,500, 13,000 years ago, or about 11,000 BC, which is the date both these sources give for the flood. And I won't go into the story of the flood today, because I did in the last class, but as I described them, there is a similar story to the story of Noah in the Bible, in the Sumerian texts, which are older, and probably the source, in one way or the other, of the biblical account. So there also is this other source of something, a major catastrophe that happened about the same time, and that is sources from the Antarctic civilization. This is another source of information which is coming from the excavations that are happening right now and have been going on for 100 years or so in the Antarctic region. Again, this has always been top secret. It was first carried out by Germans, even pre-Nazi and then Nazi Germany, and they were evidently helped by at least one, if not two, extraterrestrial races. And one of those races definitely was a reptilian race, the one that the Nazis eventually were allied with more. And those reptilians wanted to use the German people, the German technology, the German material wealth, to create a secret space program, both to help them in their attempt to manipulate and control Earth more, and to go out into space and even to other stars and invade and conquer other star systems as well. So that is, I'm just seeing one comment here, all this without a speck of evidence. There's a lot of evidence for this. I'm not going into it now, but I'll give you some of the websites that you can go to find more of the evidence. But there definitely is a lot of evidence that the Germans had created outer space bases in Antarctica, and they were going to the moon, to Mars, and even to other star systems, even before the end of the Second World War. And although they were apparently defeated in the Second World War, they really weren't defeated. They simply left Germany and transferred, which they'd already been doing for at least 10 years or more before the end of World War II. They were transferring their technology to Antarctica, and that became their main base. And although this is not so well known, you may have heard about that Admiral Byrd headed a huge military expedition to Antarctica in 1947, very soon after the end, or even starting in 46, within a year or two after the end of the Second World War. This huge expedition to Antarctica, which was really a military expedition, although it was on the surface it was called just an exploratory or a scientific expedition, but there was a huge military presence, and it was supposed to last 6 months, but they came back after a couple of months because the real job was to find out about the Nazi bases in Antarctica, and they did confront them and were defeated by them. And they had advanced technology, what we would call UFOs or flying saucers, and they had advanced weapons, and the American military could not face them. And Admiral Byrd actually made a comment, which was reported in the press from Chile, because the first place they landed was in Chile, in South America. And he said that the next war, the United States would have to face an advanced civilization which had aircraft that could travel from pole to pole very quickly. This is quoted, and I'll give you the sources of that if you want more details, more proof. But I'm just saying that the Antarctic civilization, which was where the refugees from the moon had mostly settled, the pre-Adamites, their bases continued to exist, and the Germans then built their own bases in that same area, and evidently there were reptilians also who had eventually, in the struggles with the pre-Adamites, had gained the upper hand. So this began, now we're coming to the time of 11,000 BC or so, when there was a major catastrophe. According to the Mesopotamian versions, and therefore the biblical version, it was a flood. That was the way it was experienced in Mesopotamia as a great flood or a great tidal wave, a great tsunami, which, according to Zecharia Sitchin's understanding, was caused by the slippage of the Antarctic ice shelf, creating a huge tidal wave. But in Antarctica, it was experienced as a flash freezing. That is, the civilization was existing there, and at some point about that time, about 13,000 years ago, it could have been a pole shift, which we do know the North and South poles shift every so many tens or hundreds of thousands of years. And when that happened, this civilization was frozen suddenly. And that has been discovered by modern 20th century and 21st century archaeologists. And it has not been publicly revealed yet, but there are a lot of, for the last several years, last 5 years at least, members of, like, the British royal family, members of the Vatican leadership, members of the United States government leadership have been going to Antarctica. Just like John Kerry, the Secretary of State, formerly the Secretary of State, right on the day of the last election, when Donald Trump won the election to become president, on that very same day, Kerry, the Secretary of State of the United States, was in Antarctica. And many other leaders of the world have been going to Antarctica. Why? That's not fully revealed, but something shocking is happening there, because Buzz Aldrin, the Apollo astronaut who had landed on the moon, one of the first men on the moon with Armstrong, he also went down there last year, and he had to be evacuated. He evidently had a heart attack and was taken to New Zealand for treatment. And he made some rather surprising statements there without coming out openly explaining what happened, but he saw something very shocking. And evidently what is going on there is they have discovered these ancient pre-Adamite remains, which include huge spaceships that are a mile or two under the ice in Antarctica. And on the ground level, that is about 3 miles under the ice at the South Pole, there is a civilization remains that were in an area that was full of vegetation. And it was then frozen. So this happened, again the date we don't know, but it happened by about 11,000 BC, was the final stage in this. Okay, so this is the first half of this class, and I'm just going to very briefly mention the next portion of this, which is that at a much later date, after the Sumerian civilization was established, about 4000 BC, 3800 BC perhaps, after that, other developments took place, and we're going to now get more into the religious or spiritual side again. So the most important event that took place now was the history, according to the Sumerian texts, of what became, we call monotheism. And this is a very, very controversial subject, so please hold on. What happened according to the Sumerian texts, was that Enlil and his brother Ea, or Enki, they had some sort of disagreement, and they were brothers, but half-brothers, and Enki was the older brother, but the son of another queen. They were half-brothers. Their father, Anu, had more than one queen, and the chief queen had a son, Enlil, after another queen had had the son, Ea, or Enki. So there was a competition between the two brothers, and I talked about that competition in terms of the creation of humanity, how Enki was responsible for that genetic engineering, Enlil was sort of opposed to it, and then at a later date, Enlil decided to destroy humanity and wanted to allow the flood to destroy humanity, but Enki saved humanity by having Ziusudra build a boat or a submarine, a large ocean-going vessel in which a person called Ziusudra or Utnapishtim or Atrahasis in the Babylonian texts, he saved his family and some relatives and other people and animals and plants in one way or the other, either by having all of them on board, or another explanation is he kept their DNA. In any case, the earth was repopulated after that flood. So the controversy, however, between Enki and Enlil continued. Enki had saved humanity when Enlil wanted to destroy it, but after the flood was over, Enlil realized that the earth is not going to be destroyed. That flood was not created by the Anunnaki. It had some other source, but they thought it might end life on earth, but it didn't. And so they realized that, well, these human beings were useful to them, so they were sort of reconciled to some extent, Enlil and Enki. And eventually, Enki made the plan, since he could not become the ruler, the successor to his father, or the ruler of the earth, he would arrange that his son would. So there are a lot of accounts which we have in the Egyptian mythology as well as in the Mesopotamian mythology of fights between these different gods, as we have called them in the understanding these texts, Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts, as mythology. But if we take them as historical texts, which I am doing, then there was actually a struggle, a historical struggle for succession of the rulership, at least of what we now call the Middle East, that is South Eastern Europe, Western Asia, and Northeastern Africa, that area on the western side of the Mediterranean. So what finally happened, and I am going to talk about this in more detail in future classes, but just briefly to introduce it now, Enki did arrange for his son, Marduk, to become the ruler. And the way we understand it, by our interpretation of these ancient texts as mythology, is that Marduk became the god, the chief god of Babylonia. And now we're coming to about 2000 BC. So after Enlil, who was the chief god of the Sumerians, that is, he was the ruler of their civilization, his sons should have succeeded him, you might say, but Enki managed to get his son into that position, and then Marduk became the ruler of Mesopotamia. And in the interpretation of mythology, he became the chief god. And that's the way a new development happened, because although Enlil had been the chief god, and there were clearly equal gods, or almost equal gods to him, like his brother Enki, when Marduk became the ruler, or the god of Babylonia, he became the god. In other words, there was nobody equal to him, and the ancient stories, that is the Sumerian stories of creation, were rewritten with Marduk being the creator. So there was a little difficulty because Marduk was the son of Enki, and the creation happened before Enki, so they had to kind of adjust things. And if you study those and compare the Sumerian texts, which have Anu as the chief god, and then Alalu even before him, and then Enlil, you compare them with the Babylonian stories in which Marduk, the son of Enki, became sort of then the father of Enki because he was the creator god. If you compare those two stories, you can see how the creation story was rewritten by the followers of Marduk in the Babylonian texts. And Marduk actually became the god. And the other gods practically were no longer, not only not his equals, but they were all created by him. So this was a very different version of religious or spiritual understanding than the older Sumerian one. Now, what's a very, very interesting topic, and very controversial topic, in which I am trying to understand myself. I'm really praying, meditating to get this understanding clear. What may have happened, I'm just saying may have happened because I really don't know, and I'm just open to any possibility now. I'm studying this. But what happened in Babylonia was that Marduk became the god, and he became known as Baal, which means Lord, or B-A-A-L. Baal is the chief god who was opposed to Yahweh in the Bible, Jehovah. So there are confrontations between the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Jehovah or Yahweh in the Bible. So Baal was Marduk, who was more than just a god. He was the God, the creator. And it is about the same period of time that Abraham lived, and that Moses lived, and then that the Israelite prophets lived, David and Isaiah. So what's very, very interesting is that the same sort of development that happened in Babylonia, this actually happened in the Israelite religion also. In other words, if you look at the older texts, you look at the earlier stories in the Bible, God, the Lord God, was not the only God. He was the God of Israel. He was their God, but there were also other gods of the other lands. But by the time of Isaiah especially, or especially second Isaiah, as the scholars divide the book of Isaiah into two parts, by the time of the second half of the book of Isaiah, God was God, the sole God. And in the earlier, just like in the laws of Moses, the first law is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. In other words, there are other gods, but they're not equal to or competitors with God. They're far inferior to him. But Israel is ordered to worship only their God and to disregard and to stay away from the other gods. But in the older stories, in the earlier stories, there were other gods also. And actually, when I was in college, I did a research paper on this, and I showed that in these ancient times, the followers of what we now call the Israelitish religion, at that time they were the forebears, at that time there were other gods mentioned, and the different countries had their different gods. And Jehovah, the Lord God, as the Bible, English Bible calls him, he was the God of Israel. But he became the sole God, the only God, and there can be no other gods beside him or at all. And this monotheistic idea was very interesting because it paralleled the development of Marduk as almost a monotheistic God. That is, although earlier he certainly was the son of the son of Enki, the nephew of Enlil, the grandson of Anu. But as the texts developed, as his position became more solidified, he became more powerful, he gradually became the creator and the only God. So this is a very interesting parallel that needs to be studied further, how this developed in these two different areas, and how the two gods, Baal or Marduk, and Jehovah or Yahweh, how they became two sort of competitors in the Near East, in the Western Asia. All right, that's about all I'm going to say about that now, but I'm going to talk more about this topic next class, because we are going to bring in other sources also, trying to understand how this all has happened. And I will just, for conclusion, I will just explain the dates of all of this a little more. Abraham is dated to between earliest 2000 or maybe a little bit before 2000 BC up to 1800 BC. And Marduk's ascendancy, of course he was living long before that, as the son of Enki, he had been born long before that, but his period of ascendancy when he became the ruler of Mesopotamia, Babylonia, and when he became the chief or the sole god. It was also about that same period of time, about starting perhaps 2000 BC or so is when he became prominent. And another interesting development is in Assyria at that time. Babylonia was, you could say, central Mesopotamia. Southern Mesopotamia was Sumeria. Babylonia was to the north of that, and Assyria was still farther north, what we now call eastern Syria and northern Mesopotamia. There was also, Assur was the god of Assyria, Assur, and that god also became the creator god, the one god. And then there were conflicts between Ashur and Marduk. Again, it was not so clear that this god was the only god, but he gained that sort of position of being the creator god, being the sole god. This is the natural tendency, that one would want one's own god to be the all in all. And of course that's an important theological development. And I think we can say safely that the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, totally solidified that understanding, which had been hinted at earlier and had been spoken of, especially by Isaiah in the Bible. And of course, at the time of Lord Jesus, he also talked about the one God, our Father in heaven, as he called him. But that was then finally made very, very clear. Practically the foundation of Islam is La ilaha illallah, there is only one God. So the history of this development of monotheism is something that I'm very interested in understanding, especially now that we have information from extraterrestrial sources, which were not available for the last 2,000-3,000 years, were not very available anyway. So this is going to be a very, very interesting next class as we probe into this controversial idea a little bit more. And I'll just see if anybody has any important questions or comments, and then we'll end this class. I see there are an awful lot of comments already. So I'm just going to ignore most of them unless we find some that are... I'm not going to talk about the HARP project or any of these things. I think you must... I think you watch too much Star Trek. Okay, that's a good comment, because this information is in Star Trek, and people think it's science fiction, but it's not. Star Trek, Star Wars, 2001 Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke, these are not science fiction. These are actually science fact, which were presented as fiction. I met Arthur C. Clarke personally at his bungalow in Sri Lanka in Colombo in 1985, and he at that time indicated to me very clearly that his work was not science fiction. He said that he knew, he had met extraterrestrials. So there's a lot of other sources that confirm this idea that Star Trek was not science fiction. It actually is a historical record presented as fiction. So you can do some research yourself on that if you want, but it's a fact. So Star Trek, I'm not watching too much Star Trek. I actually have hardly watched all of the Star Trek movies even once, but I do know, I have known for a long time, that Star Trek is not science fiction. It is fact. So what I'm recounting now may sound to you like science fiction, because you think these sorts of extraterrestrial civilizations are science fiction. They're not. They are science fact, which have been presented as fiction because maybe we weren't ready for them, but to gradually introduce such ideas. All right. Pure speculation? No, this is not speculation at all. This is 100% based on thorough research, including my own personal meetings with extraterrestrials. Many other people have met with extraterrestrials, and there's a lot of scientific, factual information that I'm basing this on. A lot of it is uncertain. That is, there are different versions, but a lot of it, as I've been presenting, is pretty much established. A lot of these events, although interpreted in different ways, for example, 500,000 to 1 million years ago, the creation of the asteroid belt by the destruction of a large planet, the creation of Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago, and the flood about 12